Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Justice Paradox, a lecture by UPenn legal scholar David Skeel. My name is Carl Johnson. I am the founding director of Chesterton House, which is a center for Christian studies at Cornell University, designed to help students and others to discover the intellectual riches of the historic Christian faith. For those of you who are familiar with the Center for Faith and Work, with whom we're very privileged to be co-sponsoring this evening's event, you can think of Chesterton House as a center for faith and learning in the university context across all of the disciplines. 5 years ago, we had the privilege of hosting David to give a lecture as part of our distinguished public lecture series, which places him in very good company with some of the finest Christian scholars in the world. Over the years, we've had the privilege of hosting folks like historian Mark Knoll, physicist John Polkinghorne, philosophers Al Plantinga, Nick Wolterstorff, and Eleanor Stump. And David gave a great talk entitled God's Law and Our Laws, The Kingdom of God in America, which is available on our website if you're interested in hearing more on that. Until recently, David maintained a blog with his late friend and colleague Bill Stuntz of Harvard entitled Less Than the Least. And the blog began, "We are both law professors and evangelical Protestants, a weird combination in our time. We hope it's an interesting combination. We write about crime and criminal justice, corporate governance, credit and bankruptcy, the culture wars, politics, literature, and the arts, and other topics." The blog was interesting, and those of us who were followers of it miss it very much, and yet we're delighted that we get to continue listening and learning from David in the various venues he's contributing to. He's written 3 books. He has appeared on the NewsHour, Nightline, Chris Matthews' Hardball, National Public Radio, Marketplace, and his writing regularly appears in the Wall Street Journal. His 4th and forthcoming book, which has just been accepted for publication by InterVarsity Press, will be entitled A True Paradox: How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Beautiful and Painful World. And what we'll be hearing this evening is essentially an excerpt from that forthcoming book. So you heard it first here. And if I don't have the title quite right, I'm sure David will correct me. These things change, but if I don't have it quite right, he's the one who gave me that title. In his day job, David is the S. Samuel Arsht Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and he is currently serving as the Carol Louise Boyce Visiting Professor of Law at NYU School of Law. Given our venue, I should also mention that he serves as an elder at 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. I've asked David to speak for 35 minutes, and afterwards, Peter Milligan will engage David with some questions before opening it up more broadly for Q&A. So to keep things moving, allow me to take a minute to introduce Peter as well. Peter Milligan is a corporate attorney at the New York office of Weil, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. He received a JD from Cornell Law School, where he served as managing editor of the Cornell International Law Journal. He also received an MBA from the Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell, a BS in chemical engineering with a minor in history from the University of Virginia, and was a Hansard Scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he is a trustee of Central Presbyterian Church here in New York. We look forward to hearing from Peter as well. And now please join me in extending a warm welcome to our guest, David Skeel.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Carl and Amy, and thanks all of y'all for coming out. Carl got my title correct. Whether he got InterVarsity Press's title correct or not remains to be seen. So they may be soon changing the title, but I don't think they'll be. They may change the subtitle. I don't think they'll be changing the title. So as Carl has already suggested, the remarks that I'll be giving tonight are based on a little book manuscript of mine called A True Paradox. And the subtitle, as Carl also mentioned, is How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Beautiful and Painful World. The book is a response to the widespread perception that the complexity of the contemporary world is an embarrassment for Christianity. How, according to this thinking, can an ancient religion like Christianity possibly begin to explain a world that is as complex as we now know the world to be? An atheist scientist friend of mine, whom I'll mention a couple of times in the next 30 minutes, put it this way recently in an email to me. Christianity appears to be, quote, not much more than a human creation of Bronze Age peasants derived from wholly unexceptional and largely fictional narratives. That's what my friends say to me. You can imagine what those who are not my friends say to me. Even defenders of Christianity often seem to be influenced by this line of thinking, as reflected in the tendency of a lot of recent Christian apologetics, that is, defenses of Christianity, to pretend that the world is simpler than it is. The use of simple logical arguments to, quote unquote, prove the existence of God, and the reliance on lawyerly rhetorical techniques, as in Darwin on trial types of defenses of Christianity, both seem to me to have this kind of quality. The funny thing is that the assumption that complexity is an embarrassment for Christianity actually gets things, in my view, exactly backwards. When we look at many of the complexities of life as we actually experience it, such as consciousness, which is very difficult to explain from a purely evolutionary perspective, and the way we experience beauty as transcendent and yet somehow impermanent and corrupted, and suffering as somehow wrong, not simply part of the natural order, it turns out that Christianity explains them surprisingly well. In my view, much better than materialism, the idea that there isn't any transcendent order to the universe, or other religions or systems of thought. The justice paradox, which I'll be talking about tonight, is one of 5 major puzzles and paradoxes that I consider in the major chapters of the book, and it's the next to last chapter of the book. I should perhaps note at the outset that I don't claim in the book to conclusively prove or even decisively prove that Christianity is true. I have the much more modest goal of trying to show that Christianity's explanations of some of the complexities I've just been referring to are a little bit more compelling than many people in our era assume. My hope is that the book will be a little bit like a gateway drug. After reading the book, I hope at least a few people who don't think there's any reason to take Christianity seriously, or who are harboring major doubts about Christianity, will be tempted to read the many much better books of more mainstream apologetics like Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's famous book, or Tim Keller's The Reason for God. Before I turn to the justice paradox, I should perhaps give you at least a brief definition of what I mean by justice and what I'll be referring to throughout the talk. In my view, the essence of justice is right relationship. A key component of a just legal system is the virtues we call rule of law virtues, such as laws that are transparent and defined in advance and that apply to everyone in the same way. Justice also involves an inevitable trade-off between liberty and equality, and there are, of course, a number of different theories of how to make that trade-off. Most famously, John Rawls's theory of justice. But the overarching theme, I'll argue, and I'll be assuming, is right relationship. So what do I mean by the justice paradox? Let me start with one of the world's earliest legal codes, Hammurabi's Code. In the prologue to the code, Hammurabi writes that, quote, "The god Marduk commanded me to provide just ways for the people of the land in order to attain appropriate behavior, and he vowed that his laws would," again quoting, "establish truth and justice as the declaration of the land." One of the provisions of Hammurabi's Code says that a judge who gets a decision wrong must not only be fined, but also must be permanently removed from his position. I sometimes wonder what our justice system would look like if that were the standard for judicial behavior. I'm not an expert on the ancient Near East, but I'm pretty sure that Hammurabi's code, as impressive as it was in many respects, did not actually achieve a fully just social order. More recently, Marx and his followers insisted that a revolutionary shift to working class control would resolve the conflict between capital and labor and would produce a fully just social order. Although the awful 20th century experiments with Marxism in Russia, China, and elsewhere obviously deviated from Marx's ideas in some respects, I think it's fair to say that our historical experience with Marxism does not give much of a basis for confidence that Marxism could ensure a truly just social order. These are just two examples of a phenomenon that has been repeated throughout world history. Even the very best legal codes invariably fail to achieve enduring justice. Yet their creators and their advocates repeatedly claim that they will. It's the combination of these two features, first, the persistent belief that it's possible for human society to achieve true justice, and second, the failure of every previous legal code to achieve this goal that I refer to as the justice paradox. I should note that it's possible our failure to achieve justice in the past does not mean that we're incapable of achieving a fully just society in the future. As the mutual funds say in their advertisements, past performance is not always an indication of future results. If modern life has made true justice possible, perhaps the justice paradox isn't a paradox at all. I'll say more about this when I get to the materialist explanations of the justice paradox in a few minutes. But for now, it will suffice to say that I believe the justice paradox is real, that we're not capable of creating a legal code that will assure true justice. Now, the United States might seem to be an exception to the justice paradox in one very interesting respect. I don't think anyone would claim that we've achieved perfect justice in this country. But in some respects, the founders didn't claim that we would. They realized that power will be abused and designed an intricate system of checks and balances. Perhaps they weren't over-optimistic about the capacity we have for justice at all. But I think even the founders of our republic were. And that even if the founders were not completely optimistic about the capacity for judgment, I think that subsequent generations of Americans have been. Although the founders recognized the risk that power will be misused, even they sometimes seem to think that properly crafted laws could fix the problem. The Constitution's preamble, which speaks on behalf of we the people, proclaims an intention to, quote, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. I know this from the old cartoon that many of us used to hear when we were kids, which I won't sing for you at the moment. These are rhetorical flourishes, but the optimistic in the founding documents about what can be done with law is unmistakable. Nor did this optimism disappear. A century later, after the Civil War ended slavery, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments removed its stain from the Constitution, many American leaders thought a truly just society was finally on the horizon. The summit of American legal optimism in the modern era came with the enactment of Prohibition in 1919, with the support of a large majority of Americans. We now tend to view Prohibition as a quixotic campaign that is highly unlikely ever to be repeated. This may be true in a narrow sense. It's hard to imagine a movement to remove alcohol from American households and bars getting off the ground. But in a broader sense, the spirit of Prohibition lives on. lawmakers continue to pass laws that are designed to regulate morality, such as the laws making many forms of gambling, most recently internet gambling, illegal, or creating a special category of punishment for hate crimes. Americans may gripe that the Supreme Court has, quote, abandoned the Constitution or no longer honors the rule of law, but they have considerable faith that society can be perfected with the right legal code. If the justice paradox is indeed a paradox, how can we make sense of it? In the book, I survey a variety of religious perspectives and systems of thought and highlight the difficulty they have in explaining the justice paradox. But tonight, I want to focus on materialism, both because I believe materialism is the most important contemporary response to the justice paradox, or the alleged justice paradox, and because I also believe it's the most widely held perspective in the circles in which most of us in this room travel. Most materialists, particularly evolutionary materialists, do not believe that humans belong on any kind of pedestal. We're not special from a materialist perspective in any discernible way. The materialist friend I referred to earlier, who's doing a postdoc in biochemistry right now, likes to say, or at least he likes to say to me, that if he were forced to choose one form of life as superior, he would probably, you could probably guess where he's going to go with this, he would pick insects or bacteria. Both, he would say, have colonized the world far more than humans ever will. And if a massive meteor destroyed the Earth as we know it, insects and bacteria would be the life forms most likely to survive. This would seem to suggest that materialists would be very skeptical of the possibility that human beings could ever achieve a truly just social order. But rather surprisingly, in my view, many of the same materialists that believe we were created a little lower than the ants also believe that human society is, in principle at least, perfectible. Here's what the same materialist friend wrote after he read a draft of the chapter that I'm presenting to you tonight. I would encourage you, he said, to look into Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he shows quite conclusively that violence has declined dramatically over time. We have good reason, my friend said, to be optimistic about society and about the progress towards a just social order. Pinker's argument has a lot of moving parts, and I'm not finished reading it, but unless you think I don't ever listen to anything anybody says to me, here's the book, and here's how far I am into it, that I've read the reviews. Pinker's argument has a lot of moving parts, but one of the main themes is that the combination of modern governments, which came with the emergence of the nation state 300 or 400 years ago, and commerce, together with the Enlightenment ideals of Locke, Hume, and others, has enabled us to rein in our violent tendencies. Richard Dawkins, the famous new atheist, has made a somewhat similar point. We have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth, Dawkins has written, and, if necessary, the selfish genes of our indoctrination. As I've said, it's possible that they're right. It's possible that human beings are, in fact, capable of achieving a truly just social order. I strongly believe this conclusion is mistaken, and that Pinker's stronger claims in this book cannot be reconciled with either historical or current evidence. In my view, Pinker has much too much confidence in the beneficence of the elites, who he imagines as setting policy, and in the influence of Western-style democracy, among other things. An interesting note along these lines, at the beginning of the book, he talks about all the wonderful things that have happened as democracy is taking over the world, and he uses Egypt as one of his illustrations about the inevitable march of democracy. In one sense, it would be lovely to think that the better angels view holds true for both violence and for justice. I think in some respects it does hold true as a very general statement for violence, although in a very complicated way, I don't think it holds true at all for justice. But in one sense, it would be lovely to think that this view is correct and that justice will steadily and irreversibly increase. But it's also important to note that the supporting evidence for this view is quite shaky, and that when we become convinced, if we become convinced that it's possible to achieve a truly just social order, there often is a temptation to speed things up, to speed up the process. And the best example of this was the early 20th century, when these same kinds of views about the inevitability of progress became quite prominent in this country. The eugenics movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, which called for, among other things, the forced sterilization of those who were deemed unfit, is an example of how badly that temptation to speed up this process of perfecting us can lead us astray. I don't mean to suggest that a belief in human perfectibility always leads to atrocities, but it does seem to me to create characteristic temptations. And I think that's the major and most dangerous temptation, the temptation to take shortcuts. So what does Christianity tell us about the justice paradox? Like the other monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam, Christianity teaches that our earliest parents violated the prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge, of the knowledge of good and evil, because they thought that eating the fruit would make them equal to God. The Tower of Babel recounts another effort to achieve parity with God, this time by building a spectacular tower that reached toward the heavens. The mistaken view, this mistaken belief that we can control our destiny runs through the entire Old Testament. Although Judaism and Islam each, as a result, provide insight into the justice paradox, Christianity goes much further and is, in my view, unlike any other religion in the world in this respect. Christianity is the only religion whose hero was murdered by the legal process. Jesus was tried under two of the greatest systems of law in the ancient world, the Jewish legal system and then the Roman legal system. The Jewish law worked surprisingly well under the circumstances, but even generally valuable due process protections, like the protections that were applied to Jesus, are capable of being manipulated, in particular the due process protection that required the testimony of two witnesses to establish any legal fact. The Roman law failed in large part because Pilate failed to use the escape hatches that were available to him under Roman law and under the law that he had established, failed to use these escape hatches to let Jesus go. Now, some might object to my description of the gospel accounts on the grounds that they don't think the gospel accounts are reliable historically, and therefore might argue that we shouldn't take them seriously as a basis for making the kinds of arguments I'm making. But the remarkable thing about the gospel accounts, in my view, is that even for those who are skeptical of their authenticity, even if you're skeptical about whether the Gospels are true, whether this is accurate history or not, nobody can deny the message that they're conveying about justice and about the failures of justice. The Gospels make absolutely clear that even the best laws are incapable of assuring, of guaranteeing true justice. Christianity, unlike any other religion or system of thought, rests on a story in which law fails. The justice paradox is what Christianity is all about. If the justice paradox is real, Christianity's explanation of the limited capacities of law is powerful evidence, in my view, that Christianity just might be true. If perfect justice is not possible, What does a more realistic vision of justice look like? In my view, the starting point for a Christian understanding of justice is the biblical principle that each of us is made in the image of God. There is no Jew or Gentile, no male or female, as an important New Testament passage that many in this room are no doubt familiar with puts it. The belief that each one of us is made in the image of God has been the inspiration for numerous civil rights initiatives and human rights initiatives throughout history, including the efforts of the Earl of Shaftesbury to improve the conditions of England's poor in the 18th century, and William Wilberforce's successful quest to end England's slave trade in the 19th. In the 20th century, this Christian belief served as the foundation for, although the religious language was carefully omitted from, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which was released in 1948 and is rightly seen as the start of the international human rights movement. Christians sometimes argue that human rights are not possible apart from the biblical understanding that we're made in the image of God. In my view, this isn't quite right. Many materialists believe deeply in human dignity and are firmly committed to human rights, as are many adherents of other religions and systems of thought. The principal difference is the foundation of these beliefs. Materialists often point to some of the trappings of consciousness, such as our ability to make choices about the kinds of life we lead, as the basis for human dignity and the basis for human rights. Christians believe that these capacities are not the ultimate basis for human dignity. Our dignity comes by being loved by the God who created the universe. One implication of the distinction is that the materialist conception of dignity seems to suggest, or at least this materialist conception of dignity seems to suggest, that those who are more intelligent or better able to make choices are more valuable than those who are not. While the Christian conception insists that we all have the same dignity, since we are all equally loved by God. The Christian understanding of dignity has another important characteristic as well. If each of us is made in the image of God, and God loves each of us, it's not enough for each of us simply to respect one another. We have an obligation to actively promote the flourishing of others and to seek their welfare. In my own scholarly writing, I've argued and worked with the late criminal law scholar Bill Stuntz, whom Carl has already talked about, that a legal system needs to account not just for the fact that each of us is made in the image of God, but also for the human tendency to misbehave. When most of us think about our legal system, the need to restrain misbehavior by ordinary citizens is the first thing that comes to mind. But ordinary citizens are not the only ones who are tempted to misbehave. Lawmakers and law enforcers have the same inclinations. They, too, are sinful. The American experience with prohibition is once again the easiest and most familiar example of how things can go amok. The prohibition of making, selling, or transporting alcohol was far too broad for state and federal regulators to enforce fully and systematically. As a result, regulators had considerable discretion, and discretion with regulators invites discrimination. With prohibition, someone who sold beer to Italian immigrants on the Lower East Side might well wind up in prison, or might well have wound up in prison in the 1920s. Someone who sold gin to a more elite clientele on the Upper East Side, by contrast, was more likely to wind up in an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. If everyone, both citizens and those who govern them, is tempted to misbehave, as a Christian understanding of the justice paradox teaches us, We should not be surprised that no human legal system has ever produced a just social order. The human desire to assume godlike powers for ourselves explains why men and women have repeatedly convinced themselves that the history of failure does not apply to them, that they will be the ones to prove the past wrong, that this time is different. Do Christians believe that every attempt to promote justice is therefore pointless? Not at all. A Christian understanding of the limits of law, combined with our obligation to promote the flourishing of others, can give us a vision of justice that I call law with a light touch. Here's the idea. An effective legal system has to play a double game, restraining the worst wrongs by the citizenry without empowering judges and prosecutors to do wrong themselves. The key to playing this double game well is to limit law's reach. The irony here is that the less we expect from the law, the more humility we have about the capacity of the law to assure justice, the more effective our laws are likely to be. Let me conclude with the best 20th century American example of how a Christian vision of justice can work. And in South Africa, we had another example that was almost on the same level. And I'm thinking, obviously, about the civil rights movement. In law schools, we talk a lot about the two great laws that were enacted thanks to the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But, as Bill Stuntz has written, changing the law wasn't Martin Luther King's primary objective. And just a footnote on this, Bill has just a beautiful essay that was published after he died called Law and Grace in the Virginia Law Review that I would commend to you, that I'm taking some of this from. Martin Luther King's primary objective, as I said, wasn't changing the law. He was trying to change hearts. King fought and eventually died for the right to have relationship with those who refused to have relationship with him. He wasn't trying to put anyone in prison. In fact, he and his fellow protesters went to prison themselves in their quest to create true relationship in our communities. The true heart of the movement was relationship, not law. The two laws that the civil rights movement did inspire were very unusual laws. Unlike many moral and social reforms, particularly in this country, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were not criminal laws. They were not designed to put offenders in jail or even to impose damages for the wrongs committed against blacks in the past. The objective of the Civil Rights Act was to give us a more integrated workplace in which blacks and whites and others can work side by side. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 created the modern law of voting rights, which gave us an integrated political community in which blacks and whites and others can vote side by side. The main reason that these laws were so successful is that they, unlike so many laws, help to create relationships in our communities. Perhaps you can see the connection to my earlier comments about dignity. If the dignity that comes from being made in the image of God requires that we seek one another's flourishing, as Christians believe that it does, one positive contribution that law can sometimes make is to foster relationships in contexts where they might not otherwise occur. We human beings can never fully achieve justice in our laws or in our societies. But Christians believe that the universe will one day be put to rights, not by us, but by God, and that our contributions to justice are a foreshadowing, and maybe even a tiny but indelible part of the true justice for which the universe was designed. Thank you. I'll let Peter take over.